Hello, tank fans, and welcome to the podcast all about tanks. It's Totally Tanked, and I'm Rob, and I'm here with...
Hello, it's John. I don't sound like a Dalek this week. I'm pretty sure we fixed that issue, but I would like to apologise for last month. Yeah.
And it's the 18th of September 2021, and neither of us is going to our school reunion tonight because it's lockdown.
It's been deferred again. We're locked down, which is also why we're recording remotely, for which we apologise for... the different sound once again, but hopefully it'll be improved.
We're very sad about
month.
it. We're very sad we're not catching up with some of our friends who are coming to town. We're supposed to be coming to town, but
I'm over it now, man. It's 2 years after the damn thing was meant to happen. I just don't care anymore.
But we're going to do a podcast about tanks instead. So we're going to capture the Saturday afternoon enjoyment of drinking beer and talking tanks.
Yes.
So, John, what tank are we talking about today?
The Stridsvagn 103.
Also known as the S-Tank.
S-Tank. Now, I would like to note, straight off the bat, so this is a Swedish tank, which makes it quite an unusual beast on lots of levels. And, like, war nerds try and sound authoritative by talking about Stridsvagn, but it just means armoured vehicle. So it's a bit like... Panzerkampffast,
It all sounds really fun, doesn't it?
Yes.
Big words with hard consonants in it, but no, it's just it's the 103 because it's the third tank they had in their country with a 10 centimetre gun on it. So they said, right, this is the 103. Done.
Huh.
But for those...
I didn't know that about the 103, but there we go. Thank you.
They have a fairly simple naming conventions, but there's not a simple tank. It's a very special tank because... What doesn't it have, John?
It is the only tank not to have a turret.
And it is listed as an MBT. It's not an assault gun. It's not a tank destroyer. It is a turretless tank, or some people say it's not a turretless tank. It's a chassisless tank. They put the tracks on the turret.
Yeah.
Which I think is not a bad way of actually thinking about it. It's
a good way to think about it. Should be said it's classified as a tank since its designated combat role matched those of other tanks within Swedish doctrine. To look at, it looks like...
For those who don't know what it looks like,
it's a future tank. It looks like a tank from the future. Like, if you didn't know that there was no turret and so that the gun couldn't traverse, you just think, wow, that's super special. And it often has really cool slatted armor on it to try and keep out rocket-propelled grenades.
I've also heard it called a 40-ton angry unicorn. So I think that's quite a nice thing for a tank to be called as a unicorn because it's got the horn sticking out the front. So for those who don't know, it looks like it's a wedge shaped from the front with the barrel sticking straight out the front of it, all in one go. So there's no turret. It's just one barrel sticking out of the hull.
Why did the Swedes do this, Rob? Because it's a question with beautiful answers.
I know, it's because when I first started thinking about the tank, I say it's a different tank, and do we really want to go? It hasn't seen any combat. What are we going to talk about? But the reasons why they chose it and how they came about it and what actually happened with it is actually really interesting for the development of the tank. So, 1956, the Swedes have just bought some Centurions from the Poms because the Poms needed to get some hard cash coming into their economy.
And at that time, as we discussed last month, Centurion was the world tank. The Germans weren't allowed at that time to make tanks, so anyone who wanted to buy a tank from someone else pretty much ended up buying Centurion.
But as soon as they bought it, the Swedes started thinking, okay, so we've bought this, now what's going to be our next tank? And that's where they came up with, they had three options. They were looking at a heavily armoured, big-gunned American or English tank. So with high cost, and then it was the option A. B was a French-German light tank with high mobility and even bigger gun, but low armour, and that was option B. And then they came up with option C, which was a Swedish tank made indigenously within Sweden, and they ended up choosing the third option for a number of different reasons. Now, at the time, during the middle of the Cold War, or the beginning of the Cold War, Sweden was a neutral country. Now, they had
still is,
and they declared their neutrality during the Second World War. Now, one of the big reasons why Germany didn't invade, the Nazis didn't invade, because they needed a neutral country that they could trade with that the Allies wouldn't bomb. So that was a really good reason for them not to invade. And they took over.
Swedish iron ore was also very important to the Nazi war machine, and that might have been disrupted with an invasion.
But the main reason is because if they invaded and took it over, then the Allies could just go through and bomb the hell out of it.
Yeah, they wouldn't have got the iron ore out of Sweden anymore because it would have been bombed to hell, yeah.
Whereas as a neutral country, they could buy it from them quite happily, even if the Swedish government was leaning towards the Allies. So anyway, Sweden's had its neutrality. They've been neutral for a very long time.
And it should be noted, before we defame the Swedes too much, that neutral Sweden was an incredible intelligence resource, and the aid it gave to the Danish resistance, for example, and in terms of being a safe harbour for Danish Jews. So it wasn't just that Sweden was playing sides against each other. Sweden was doing a lot of very good things while staying neutral.
I agree. It's a case of they had some hard choices to make, and they made the choices that were best for them and possibly for a lot of other people as well.
Probably, they played their hands better than the Finns or the Norwegians, and definitely the Danes. So in that, it was hard times. Sweden did pretty well in its management of those issues.
But at the same time, so we come to the 50s, it's the start of the Cold War. They've just bought the Centurion, and they're thinking about the next tank they want to buy. And what they've decided to go for is the S-tank. And part of that was by building their own tank, they, one, maintained an indigenous capability within Sweden to build tanks, and two, they weren't showing any favouritism by buying a NATO or American or German or French or anybody else's tanks. So they're saying, yep, we're so neutral, we're going to build our own and not put ourselves in the camp of one side or the other by having bought from the US or the UK or France.
I think that was definitely a factor, but the other factor was simply that the capabilities they wanted in this tank did not exist and would not exist for 20 years in any other country's tank manufacture. And not only that, some of those capabilities still don't exist today anywhere else. So they wanted things, and they were willing to pay to get them that just weren't available from anywhere else.
So they made the choice first, and then they came up with the design. And when they looked at the design, this is where Sven Berge came up with his innovative design of saying, you know what? He looked at the maths. It's incredible when you actually start looking at the maths of things, saying, you know what, most tanks get destroyed by 50% of tanks get destroyed by hits to the turret. So
the taller the tank was, the more likely it was to get hit. So he said, right, we're going to build a really low tank.
Yeah, and then he said, well, do we really need a turret?
But that is where it comes in, that the autoloader that they also wanted.
Because they couldn't have
autoloaders. Every time your tank starts spinning around and your gun goes up and down, the autoloader comes out of alignment with the gun, and then to reload, you have to realign all those things. And what they've done in the S-tank is keep them all absolutely static in relation to each other, so that it's a very simple autoloader.
Yeah. So whereas the oscillating turrets of the AMX-13s and
which is also solving that problem, but yeah.
Which are very lightly armoured turrets, suddenly with a great autoloader, but lightly armoured turrets and very small, whereas now you've got the autoloaders already built into the tank, it's in the rear of the tank, and it's all going to happen there. So he came up with this idea, and he also saw the effectiveness of the Stug 3s and the Hetzers and so forth from the Germans were using in World War II, and said, well, those are very effective because of their shape, their size, and their firepower that they could provide. So why don't we just do that, but make them better as you do, and go from there.
Now, I would also say with this tank coming known as the S-tank, it was early in its life called Alternative S for Sweden. So that is part of why it's become simply known as the S-tank.
Yeah, and people didn't want to have to try and spell Stridsvagn.
Well, I mean, all Swedish tanks are technically Stridsvagns of some designation or another. But so, in terms of design, what we've got here is there's a 105 gun based on the British L7, but it's a Bofors design with significant improvements.
Slightly longer, so higher rate of higher velocity as it leaves the barrel.
And better ammunition. The Swedes make their own ammunition, and I think it's a 20% improvement in penetration, they reckon, from the higher tolerances from their processes. But certainly they believe, and I see no reason to doubt them, that there are significant advantages to the way they custom cook their ammunition. So well done them.
Yep. So it's got the 105 gun in it. It was first designed in 56. They built some prototypes in 60. They had a look at them and said, yep, these look pretty good. And they started rolling them out from 66 to 71. And they built 290 altogether, in use only by the Swedes. Other countries did lease them for a while. They would lease a couple just to test them out and see, do we want to use one of these as our own total tank or build something like it? But everybody turned around during the 70s and said, yeah, look, they're fun, they work well, but we want to maintain a nice big turret, and either the Leopards or the Chieftains or the Centurions or M60s or whatever else they've got. But everybody had a bit of a look at them just in case.
Yeah, I mean, it represented the end of a moment where everyone knew until that time that a tank on the move couldn't reliably hit at any sort of range another tank. And it was built into that moment to say, well, if we can't hit them while we're moving, then why not just, what is the turret actually doing? And then in the 60s and 70s, stabilization and a whole bunch of other systems came online that made it possible for a moving tank to actually dream about hitting a target at any sort of range.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when it was developed, the Swedes were looking at the Centurion and said, these turreted tanks only have a 15% chance of hitting the target whilst firing on the move. Whereas with this vehicle, they could stop. So basically everybody at that time was stopping to fire accurately. And so the S-Tank could do that quite happily, as saying, yep, stop, maneuver in position, maneuver till the barrel's on target, and then fire accurately. With the autoloader, they could fire a rapid number of shots. However, just after it started being rolled out, the stabilization computers were being built into the tanks, and they were getting a much higher accuracy rate of being able to fire on the move. With your Leopards and their Bierstein challenges, so forth, of being able to keep the barrel on target, all those sort of things happened in the 70s, but it was still a good tank.
Yeah, no, it wasn't just stabilization, because there's a whole bunch of things that targeting computers were starting to do to, predict the fall of shot and bring it into contact with the target. But the S tank. Oh, never mind. I've forgotten what I was going to say there. Keep going.
Well, as we say, it was built for the Cold War, and while they were a neutral country, their main threat, they felt the main threat was going to be from the Soviet Union. And of course, the joke is the Swedes' first line of defence against the USSR is Finland, which is a very good first line of defence to have. But
as the Finns say, there's so many Russians. Where will we bury them all?
But the point being is that they had now had an indigenous capability of building their own tanks, and they had them deployed, and they came up with this concept of it being able to take out. Had the gun to be able to take out a Russian tank quite happily with the 105. By being so low and getting into a hull down position, so that only the barrel. There was absolutely no.
Well, the hull can't be too far down, because otherwise the barrel doesn't stick anywhere.
Well, there's not much to hit if it's in a hull down position. So it's such a good defensive tank in that regard, and being the ability to fire accurately from a defensive position, it was huge for their because they weren't going to be invading anybody with this tank, but they were going to be defending their own territories with it.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's what it's built for.
It's worth thinking about it in terms of, it requires so many things to work, because the hydropneumatic suspension controls the elevation of the gun. And in many tanks, the suspension may or may not be working perfectly at any given time. In the S tank, if the suspension isn't working, they literally can't get the barrel on target. And similarly, it's got apparently an amazing neutral skid steer capability, I should say. So you can actually turn the tank faster than most tanks of the era could turn the turret.
Yeah, so they could spin around if they were on the move. They could hit the clutch and the brakes and spin the turret, the tank on its axis quicker than a turret could turn its to engage a target to the sides or the rear with under, I think it was 12 seconds, which was damn fast at that time.
I think it's something like 2 seconds, but it's really fast.
It's 12 seconds without using the clutch brake, but 2 seconds on and then stop and fire. So it was very effective as being able to stop, get the gun on target and fire. And you're right about this.
But also, stunt driving in a tank is not something that's a really acquired skill. You need to drive that tank a lot and be willing to break some tanks to gain those skills in the driver. And, in most armies, most tank crews only do a few years
just
before
remember,
they move on to something else.
Sweden has had military service, 1 year military service since...
Yeah. I wouldn't be trusting a 1 year military recruit to do this stuff we're talking about.
But that's the thing, is from 1901 to 2010, they had conscription in Sweden, where you went off and did your 1 year service, and they reintroduced it in 2017, so they're back to doing it. So you would have had conscripts driving these things, because that's if you've got a conscript army, then that's where they're going to.
Yeah, but if you've only got 290 tanks, that's the total ever built. So you're probably never talking about a deployable formation more than 100 or so, I would have thought. You can probably afford to keep your army lifers in. The whole military isn't conscripts.
But the other ones we should get into the crew on the tank. So
you only need one. It's the only armoured fighting vehicle in history that can be fully operated with a single person.
The K2, the Black Panther, can do it effectively.
Okay.
Or speculatively. We did mention that.
Okay. I view that as more a future capability, but
okay. And one comment I read in one of the videos I was watching saying is that it has to be a really good tank for a zombie apocalypse because you only need the one person. So away you go. So I'm thinking, that's a good way to think about it.
Well, and then the bulldozer blade, you just leave that deployed the whole time. So the bulldozer blade's worth briefly mentioning in that they started out having one per platoon of 4, and then they just realised, one, it was great having the bulldozer blade as armour down there, and B, they were so useful for everything else they needed the tanks to do.
Digging holes is what the army loves to do, and if you've got a bulldozer blade, you can just dig really nice holes. So everybody wants to be able to do it, so they did. The only issue with the bulldozer blade was you did actually have to get out and unhinge it and then fix it back in place manually. There was nothing built into the tank.
It was a 3-man job for a good half hour to deploy the bulldozer blade, but
but you're right, it did provide extra armour on the front of the tank if you were ever in a position where the lower front glasses was exposed. Now, of our crew we're talking about, we only have three people is what it's,
and they're all drivers.
And yes, they can all drive the tank. So you've got the commander, who has a ability to drive the tank and lay on the gun and fire the gun. You have the driver, who's also the gunner, who has the ability to drive the tank and lay on the gun and fire the gun. And
so between those two, all of the controls are fully operational, and either of them can do any task. And then it's up to them to decide amongst themselves who's going to do which bits and pieces.
Yeah, so the commander has a override capability. So whereas he can, the hunter tracker capabilities of saying, "Yep, I've used my periscope or to my cupola to spot a target out to the right because he's only got vision out to the front and right. The driver's got vision out to the front and left. But if the commander sees a target out to the right, he can spot that. He can toggle a joystick which forces the tank to turn that direction and lay the gun onto that target.
Assuming the suspension is working.
Yeah. Once the gun is on target, the gunner then takes over and can fire. The tank stops, and the gunner can then aim in and fire the round onto that target. All the while, the commander is then looking for the next target if they want to fire at something else. Now, the radio operator is the third person, and they sit facing backwards. They have a rear vision, and when the tank needs to reverse out of a scrape or a hull down position and move away from the area, then he just drives the tank backwards. He's got vision out to the rear.
I actually reckon all tanks should do this.
So there's none of this
looking backwards, looking in a mirror,
or realistically, it's having the commander sticking its head out and telling the driver left stick, right stick, or back a bit, right a bit, whatever else. It's a case of you've got a driver who's got full control of the tank, and he can drive the tank backwards at as high speed as they can drive forward, so up to 60 k's.
Yeah. So once you've got your one shot off and taken out the first of the Soviet tanks, you get out of there and you move, because they're about to call down all of the artillery in the world on your position. And this is incredibly sensible to be able to do this, particularly for a, let's say, a defensively orientated tank, which this definitely is.
Yeah, and look, it was originally designed for only having the two crew members, the commander and the gunner, but they decided, look, that's too much work for two guys to take on. We need a third person. So whereas everybody else in the world at that point in time was having 4 or 5 person crews,
well, except the Russians, but yeah, I take your point.
Yeah, they said, well, we can do it with 2, but we kind of really need 3 people in there just to be able to spread the work around and have those 2 not get so fatigued. So, getting back to your conscripts and the size of your forces, by having fewer people, you also have a requirement to have fewer trained operators of the vehicles, and so you could have, as you say, not have as many people dedicated to the tank force, which training is a huge cost and time sink of whatever, especially, as I say, if you are getting conscripts to do it, because you've got to go through that training every year.
Yeah, look, and one thing war nerds tend to never talk about is pensions. Which actually makes up a huge part of the cost of the defence force, and the more people that you have not doing anything particularly useful, you're still going to pay for 20 years at the end of life if they've done a full career with you. So, getting man count down has been a constant imperative of militaries throughout history. And this tank certainly helps with that. But one thing I love about this tank, when I heard that, they've got these dual controls, and that you can have a third driver sitting at the back facing backwards so they can drive the tank in reverse, I thought, oh wow, that's very advanced for the 1950s to have some sort of common data bus that all the inputs are being put into and it's resolving. No, that is not how they did it. They did it with bicycle chains. Bicycle chains everywhere. And as we've mentioned, I do build freak bikes as a hobby. And so I know bicycle chains quite well. And one thing they're terrible at is staying on if anything changes. And one thing tanks do is they get hit incredibly hard by other things, and, their chassis bend and buckle, at which point your hydropneumatic suspension is gone, and probably all of your tensioned bicycle chains that are linking your controls together, some of those aren't going to be very happy either after you've taken any sort of damage. This is not an enormously survivable tank in combat.
But the thing is about a bicycle chain is you can just put it back on the cogs. Whereas if you lose your wiring and if you've got electronic,
but you can have redundant wiring. You can have 5 different sets of wires. Yes, bicycle chains, you can be retensioned depending on how you set it up, or you can just take links out or things like that. But that's not, you don't want to be doing any of that in combat.
No.
But fundamentally, part of, I think, why they kind of like the S-Tank is what a tank crew likes is a tank that's really good when it's in perfect condition. And when something's gone wrong, they can go back to the depot and have a hot shower and a meal and think about things. What you don't want to do is be grinding away forever on the front line.
No, exactly. And look, other things to mention about the tank is quite important is the short track length. So,
which is a problem, but yeah.
It's a problem, and it's a solution to a problem, but it's also a problem. By having a short track length,
it can turn to lay the gun on things.
It can turn to lay the gun on things easily. It can also have the pneumatic suspension of being able to raise and lower the hull and the rear for elevation up and down. But it does mean that it doesn't do as well in deep snow and mud, which you're going to get in certain places.
Mm-hmm. All of Sweden, all of the time, is either snow or mud. That's pretty much what the country's made of.
Well, I haven't been there, so I can't say, but I'm told there's lakes and swamps and flats and hills. They don't have terribly
and lots of snow for half the year.
Yeah, they don't have fjords supposedly. So I had to read that.
Norway's where the fjords are from. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the short track base does present an issue there, but
let's talk briefly about the other problem with the short track base. When you've got a gun fixed into the chassis of the tank, and you go down a ditch, what happens to the front of your gun barrel at the bottom of the ditch?
It gets stuck in the ground.
Yeah, and you look at pictures of the S tank. There's a lot of quite exotic Tampions. Around, cover it, try to stop dirt getting in.
If you use your pneumatic suspension well enough, you could probably angle the rear of your tank up, so that you can, or the front of the tank up, so that you're reducing that. But it doesn't have a good trench clearing capability because of the short track base. It also doesn't have a good obstacle clearing, as in height obstacle clearing capability because of that. So, whereas the Centurion did have much better than that because of the longer track base.
Yeah, I mean, Centurion was sort of built as the best tank of the Second World War, and the S-Tank was built as the tank of the future, and in so many ways remains the tank of the future, even after it's exited service. Power plant is so interesting.
Yes, the twin engines. So it was the first tank to have a gas turbine engine installed in it. Mm-hmm. And everybody says, and when you hear the gas turbine switching on in the tank, it does sound like, Mad Max is here to start playing. It was just one of those like the toe cutter scenes kicking in the turbine. And the first tank with the gas turbine, everybody else has since moved on to them because it provides that extra speed and power and high mobility.
They also pioneered combined diesel and gas power for machinery. This was the first vehicle of any sort with it. And most Western warships now use something very similar.
Yes.
To combine being able to cruise and being able to sprint. And it's not that simple. I believe the Chinese are still trying to figure out how to do it, and they're very clever. So, it was quite an achievement to produce the world's first Kodag power plant for this tiny little fleet of tanks.
By having the two engines, it could rumble along, have the diesel engine rumbling along for any sort of slow-moving activities. But as soon as you wanted to put the foot down, and the gas turbine would come on, and you kick the speed up to about 60 k's an hour, depending on the loadout.
I would note the chieftain who we often reference, his Stridsvagn video. Does have him trying to drive it, and he stalls it a lot because he can't manage the revs for the gas turbine and that. And he has driven Abrams, which also have gas turbines.
As he said, it was more than 10 years ago for him to doing that, and I'm sure if he'd had more than 5 minutes in the tank, he would have been fine at keeping the revs up in the right way. And it's an automatic transmission, so stalling a tank with an automatic transmission should be hard, but with the gas turbine, it looks like it's something you can easily do. And he was just worried he didn't want to run into anything.
No,
I can understand that.
That's fair enough. But I think it is fair to note that this is not a tank that would perform well in the hands of conscripts. This needs people who have trained with it a long time.
I think an hour's worth of driving that, and it'd be very simple.
But you're not doing your neutral skid steers to lay the gun on the target.
You're not. That is the hands of your experienced trainers. Type thing. Anyway, so that's the short wheelbase. So we've gone all over that.
Yes.
Don't worry, folks. I did see a tank phone in one of the videos. It's not mentioned anywhere in the stats for the tank, but I remember I saw a picture on a box on the outside saying "telephone" or something like that.
Oh, good. Good to know.
I'm hoping that wasn't a stock footage photo of some other tank, but I'm assuming because it was a photo of the 103, the S tank, that it was a tank phone there. So don't worry, I'm pretty sure they have one.
So it's also worth noting it has one of the most civilized reloading systems I've ever seen, because with many tanks, someone has to stand on the turret and 3 people have to pass the rounds up, and then they have to get passed down into someone standing. Yeah, like you need like 6 people. Even quite modern tanks, it can be very strenuous. Whereas if you take your whatever's carrying the ammunition and back it up against this tank, you're pretty much just one person loading it in.
Yeah.
So
loading from one box, turning around, shoving it in the back of the S tank, and it goes straight into the autoloader. So with the autoloader, it can have 50 rounds in there. There's a number of different magazines, and the commander or the gunner can choose what round is being fired each time. So you can, and once you've fired off your 50 rounds, that's a lot of dead tanks. But once you've fired off your 50 rounds, it takes about 10 minutes to reload the autoloader. So it's not a long time. If you pull back into your lager and pull up the ammo wagon and 10 minutes back, you're back into operations.
I can't contemplate what sort of bad day you're having to have fired 50 tank rounds, given that you're going to be, probability of kill is something like 0.8. And then go and reload and go back out with another 50 rounds. I mean, that is, you're playing some sort of video game at that point.
Now, one of the things it does do is the autoloader ejects the cartridge out the back of the tank after firing, which is great. I think it's that way. You don't need to unload the empty cartridges when you're reloading the tank. You don't have any empty cartridges rolling around the inside of the tank or anything like that. But on training exercises, I bet there was some poor bugger whose job it was to go around in the trail of all these tanks that might have been firing off rounds during training and pick up all the cartridges.
It's a lot of brass to pick up, yeah.
That would have been a lot.
And I do
want to be a bit shit job.
I do wonder if any S-tank ever actually bogged itself in with all the brass behind it that it couldn't reverse back over to...
It does kick it out a fair way, but that's not a bad point of you have to be running over that so if you're carrying out the activities. So
but having said that, you don't normally fire more than 2 or 3 times before you need to change positions. So, yeah.
All right. So with the autoloader, it could fire up to 15 rounds a minute. So again, it's a fast-firing autoloader.
So it's like a round less than every 2. It's like 2.5 seconds.
Yeah, 2.5, 3 seconds. Yeah. It's got a.
Hang on. Let's bear in mind, you can only fire that at things that are where you've pointed the entire tank.
Well, if all the Russians are coming around the corner at the same time, or in a line, you just bang, bang, bang.
Yeah, but it's not like a turreted tank that could be firing in quite different directions every 3 seconds.
No. But as I said, with the hunter-killer activities, the commander can fire it and then already be laying onto the next target before he pulls the trigger again. So, or telling the gunner where to pull the trigger once it's on to the next target is designated.
As long as the enemy don't want to live and are obligingly coming at you in a straight line, it's fantastic.
Well... That's how a lot of things happen in straight lines, because if
it's the only available path. Yeah, okay, I get it.
And you're firing from ambush, which is the way you do it. So it's only got a short range, but then again, Sweden's not that big a country at 390 kilometres. So that's
hang on. We just called Centurion the best tank ever with a range under 100 kilometres. So, I mean, this is a marathon run.
What about the mono wheel? No. It could do. It's got a 2-speed, two-gear automatic transmission that can go about 50 to 60 k's both forward and reverse.
Again, double what Centurion could do. 4 times the range at twice the speed.
It's got no NBC gear listed against it, but it supposedly could be prepared for one. So they didn't buy any. They didn't think they were going to be a target for nukes, obviously. But
I suspect the thinking was around the crew just wearing NBC suits, which is horrible. But nothing's fun in that once that stuff goes around.
But that might actually lead into the next point, is that there was actually no heating provided in the tank. You could get some of the heat from the engine to keep you warm, but there was actually no heater inside of it, which seems strange for a place that's covered in snow half the year.
Hang on. You've got an auxiliary engine running the whole time, and the heater in your car is just ducting off your engine
exactly.
as well.
That's exactly what I was thinking. So again, that's probably why it's not sealed for NBC, because it's still always going to be sucking in air, which is then going into your cabin rather than being vented somewhere else. So yes, I think you are wearing NBC, which is also quite warm. So it's probably not a bad compromise of without having to have a tank fitted with all that sort of equipment.
Now, Rob, I've never worn NBC gear. I think you might have trained with it, but
yes, it's very warm.
It's very warm in Australia, but I just wonder if you get it nice and sweaty, and then you're in the middle of a frozen forest, whether that doesn't become extremely cold.
I'm sure. Well, it wasn't frozen at Puckapunyal, but it was certainly cold enough when I was wearing it.
Yeah, okay. All right.
It did keep you warm, yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah, but I mean, kind of, planning for the end of the world has a lot of problems. Yeah.
Now, other parts of the armament, it had a couple of MGs. It had a twin-mounted MG on the driver's hull, so it had a double-dacker, as some of us would say. Which would have to be reloaded from the outside, but what the I mean, it's a 7.762's HMG, general purpose machine guns, of the Swedish brand. I can't remember what it was called.
KSPs, I think. But yeah.
And
one of them designed for anti-aircraft work. Ho ho ho.
That was So the commander had a remote controlled MG on the outside, available to. Remote control from inside the tank for anti-aircraft. So basically, it's on a cupola to shoot at, throw rounds at low-flying helicopters or whatever else. So again, what the usefulness of these guns would be, who knows? But they were there.
Yeah, I mean, 3 machine guns for 3 crew is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And if you're facing the Soviet hordes, maybe you can see some advantage. The other thing worth noting, well, not the only other thing worth noting, but was actually quite amphibious.
Yes. Yes. So so they built it so they can put these waterproof skirts up around the top of the tank within about 20 to 25 minutes, and then just roll down into the water. You'd want, again, you're not looking at...
this is for lakes and rivers. This is not
lakes
for
and rivers.
seas.
Open sea.
Yeah,
this is not open seas with anything with waves on it. You want fairly calm water because, again, it's not going to be happy. But so your driver gunner then stands on top of the tank with these skirts raised up around the sides of it, and he remote controls the tank across the lake or river, which there are plenty of in Sweden, and it can go at about 6 k's an hour with the tracks just propelling it along through the water.
Yeah, which, I mean, it's one of those things that it's grossly inefficient just to have the tracks creating drag to create your forward motion. At the same time, it does actually work, and 6 knots is just fine for lake and river work if you're only trying to cross a few hundred metres of water.
Which means that you don't have to have bridges all around the country, especially if you're planning on defensive activities. And so if you're worried about the civil engineering of your road works around the country and the pathways that they provide to any invading armies, which Sweden was, which is why they have certain areas, which is they had taken all these things into consideration of their civil engineering of, okay, if we're going to get invaded by the USSR, how do we want our roads built so we can defend them, so that we can have these tanks parked in a position to ambush any Russian tanks coming along from obvious landing points, beachheads, and best exploit that. Just the same way they built a number of roads around the country for their aircraft, so they can land their vegan aircraft on their short takeoff, have resupply elements already cached on those designated areas, and so if they need to, they've already factored in the civil engineering of the entire country to be for defensive activities. Now,
but I've also got to say, if you've got your fleet of S tanks, you've got a country that's basically made up entirely of rivers and lakes. You're dealing with a Russian force that has somehow gotten across Finland and is probably not at 100% full strength. Anyway, after that experience...
Well, they might have just come across the Baltic as an amphibious force and landed the beachhead. Because...
Sure, but my point is that if your S-tank can retreat across the river, and then your Russians are having to come up and... Okay, Russian tanks can snorkel up to, 5 meters depth? You know, you'd want to know a lot about the water body you're trying to cross to use that. You could really make it very, very difficult for a force trying to cross that river with these tanks. It would be an absolute nightmare, even with just a handful of these tanks trying to make a crossing with an armoured force.
Which is why if you don't need bridges everywhere to get your own forces there, forcing the enemy to cross them without a bridge is a significant activity. If you can set up your own amphibious tanks to get into position with only 20 minutes setup, whereas the Russians take a couple of hours to set theirs up.
Yeah, and even then they're snorkeling. So if the water gets deeper than 5 meters, or if someone's put a tank trap at the bottom of the river, you're in an immense world of hurt. Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Other fun things is you had a crew maximum height of 1.75 metres, so about 5'10". Now, I don't know if you've met a lot of Swedes, but the first two I met were about 6'5" and 6'6". And that's set the standard for my expectations.
They're big lads, and none of them are getting a job driving an S tank. So
anybody over that height were sent to the Centurions, supposedly. But what it did say to me that you're limiting your in a country of tall, lanky blondes and redheads, you are limiting your available crew selection down by that. I thought that was something you'd think to take in account of, but obviously they said, we've got a big enough population and we can get people in there.
Look, I mean, the Russians do this as well, where they make their tanks completely unusable for anyone over about 5'8". And
yes, but there's 250 million of them, whereas there's 7 million Swedes.
Yeah, but there's only 100 tanks. So what's the old joke about the Australian Army? You know, not everyone wants to drive a tank, which is lucky because we've only got one.
Yes, something like that. Well, I was thinking about that. I mean, can you imagine if Australia after World War II being told, okay, you've got these choices of what tanks you want to try and build and how you want to ever going for the idea of, yes, we're going to build our own tank and we're going to do something totally different than everybody else. Can you imagine Australia ever saying that? I really don't.
Look,
maybe
fundamentally, it tends to be in most militaries quite self-selecting. Like my friend Jeremy, who was a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne, is 6'5", and when he was told his choices were jumping out of planes or being in tanks, he said, "I will jump out of planes. I don't like heights. I don't like jumping out of planes, but I don't want to be stuck in a tank when I'm 6'5". So they didn't have to have a policy; they just sorted that out amongst themselves. Yeah, and you know, as anyone who watches the Chieftains videos knows, a very tall man can still squeeze himself into a lot of tanks.
There you go. Yes, he is, and he does mention that it wasn't too bad a fit, but he didn't like being able to his knees being stuck up around his when trying to drive. That's okay.
Yeah. I think it's time for us to take a break quite soon, Rob.
All right, so one of the other things about the S-Tank is it was designed all about the crew safety. So even though you've only got 3 people, or possibly 2, or possibly 1, it was designed all about crew safety, which means keeping people alive, which is not generally the first priority when building tanks for a lot of countries, but for the Swedes it certainly was.
Well, you've only got 100 highly trained stunt drivers, you've got to preserve them.
Yeah, that's right. And they found it, for the idea of it and all the training and testing that they did, that the crew safety was very, very strong, very good. So, sorry, only had 90 to 100 mils of armour on the front, plus your dozer blade, plus
highly sloped armour, though, to be
highly
fair.
Sloped, exactly, hugely sloped armour. You also had some non-slip grating placed upon the front. But one of the things that people didn't realise is that until it was brought out in '66, they'd actually had developed a grill-like front to place around on above the hull of the tank, around the barrel, which wasn't actually revealed until 1993. So almost 30 years after the tank's been deployed, they finally let out the secret out of the bag, saying, "Yeah, we've actually got this other bit of armour to stop heat rounds from."
That's the slanted armor, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically a grill on the front of the tank. So
to detonate an RPG or something like that. So it fires its little jet and it's a long way away from the tank by the time it dissipates. Yeah.
Which again brings, and they also on the C version, which was developed in the 1980s, and all their tanks were upgraded. So they, by only having 290 tanks, it was actually a pretty easy upgrade path for the tanks. And so as they came up with innovations, they said, right, we need a bigger engine. Okay, let's bring them all in, and we're going to swap out the engines for all of them. Bang, they did that. We want to better this, we want to better that. Okay, done. We've approved the changes over the 30-year period that it was in service. They just bring them in and upgrade all of them rather than have, okay, these 10 are the B version, these 10 are the C version, and these... No, they just did all of them over time.
I mean, on that basis, you should only ever have just one tank, and then you can always have that on block.
Yes.
Sorry.
But what that did mean is that when the C version came in, it was the last version of the design of the tank. They also put in jerry cans along the outside of it, and they said, 22 litres of petrol strapped to the outside of the tank, 9 each side. That forms a blade of armour as well, because if it gets hit by a round, yes, the round goes off and there's petrol. But you know what the diesel happens with the diesel? It just goes all over the ground and burns there rather than onto the tank and burning on the tank. So it was quite a simple and effective way of extending the range. Yes, you then have, if you ever want to refill the tank with your jerry cans, you're sitting there with a freaking jerry can. But that's
I would imagine the refueling vehicle, you're just really kind of moving the hose from can to can every couple of minutes. It wouldn't be the worst job in the world.
No, you're probably right. Right. Rather than having to sit there with holding the can up and tipping it into the petrol tank.
Yeah.
Now, one of my questions with the two different engines, of course, is you got two different engines. You'll also need different parts, different training, and whether or not people are qualified trainers, repair people on both the Rolls-Royce and the...
was it a Rolls-Royce? I thought it was General Electric.
One of them was the Rolls-Royce, which got turned into the Detroit diesel in the 80s, which was the C upgrade.
Yeah. Sorry, it was a Boeing 502 turbine.
Yeah, and the other one was started out. So again, it's one of the issues with having two engines is you then have to have two lots of parts, two lots of crew training repair person, maintenance training. So for the two of them. So
I assume the Boeing turbine could run on diesel though.
Must have. Petrol. I don't know. Actually, I didn't look at that.
So and then after the re-engining, it was a Caterpillar turbine, and if Caterpillar don't make a diesel turbine, I'd be very confused. So yeah.
Now, one of the things I didn't find is, yes, the armour on the front was 90 to 100 mils. I didn't find anything saying what the side armour was. So, did you see anything about that?
No, but you only ever face the enemy with this tank, so...
What if the enemy gets around your side, though?
Run away. Run away. 2 forward and 2 reverse gears, which I've got to say is a triumph of gear design.
Yeah, as I said, the automatic transmission, you can just put the foot down and it'll go. You either have low speed or you have high speed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier when there's only 2 gears. One's for starting and one's for running.
Yeah. It wasn't a night fighter, so where most tanks would have all sorts of infrared lights and infrared spotlights to be able to shine out into the darkness so they can see what they're seeing with their limited capability of MBG gear in the 60s and 70s. They said, you know what? Bugger that. What we're going to do is just going to put a couple of flare launchers, mortars on the
huge
back of the
71mm mortars. They were firing very big flares.
They say, we'll just fire those off at night. If we need to see anything at night, we'll just fire those off and everything will be illuminated anyway. So we can see what we're doing. Everybody with their night vision gear will be suddenly blinded by. And we're so well hidden, because that's the idea of these tanks, is they're to be so well hidden that the enemy's not going to be able to see them anyway. So who cares about?
I think you're less well hidden after you fire your 71mm mortar, but I'll concede it.
But the thing is, the flare doesn't actually go off until it goes up there. So it's not actually, you're not actually seeing where the mortar's coming from. There's no big discharge flash from them.
If I was the Russians trying to cross a fortified river in Sweden in the event of the big one happening, nighttime would have been a good time to do it, though. I think there'd be some advantages there.
I don't know about that, but anyway, other simple little things of the vision slits for the commander and the drivers. They all had little windscreen wipers on them and little hoods over the top too, and even when the gunner fires the gun, the driver's sight, the gunner's sight will blank out for half a second so that they don't get blinded by the flash of the gun going off right in front of their eyes. So they could, with windscreen wipers, yes, you can have washer fluid in them as well, so you can wash the any dirt or dust off your vision slits with your little windscreen wipers there. The magnifications inside the sights were 6 times, 10 times, and 18 times, so really good optics.
I believe it was the best in the world at the time.
Probably because they went for said, right, by saving so much weight on not having a turret, not having as many crew, you've got a lot more things you can play with. They did introduce some laser sights and more advanced targeting techniques in the 80s for the C version. They did look at the upgrading it to a D version during the 90s, but at that stage they were just going, well, everybody else has got these other bigger tanks that have been built from the 80s onwards, and we're still running around with a 1960s design. With these gun stabilizers, you can't really say that tanks can't fire on the move anymore, because they can. So the option was there for Sweden to upgrade their existing S tanks to a D version during the 90s, and that would keep them going for a bit longer. But they decided, look, may as well just go out and buy the Leopard 2s, because Leopard 2s are out there and they're doing all those things well. They did even try a remote control version of the S-Tank, was prototypes. So they were looking for, again, crew survivability of, how about I sit over here and just let my drone tank go out and blow stuff up? It's still quite possible. One of the other, and when they were retired, what the Swedish government scrapped most of them, but they kept quite a number, and they said to the world, hey, does anybody want to buy an S-Tank to put in your tank museums? And
it was quite weird, the number of countries that said yes, including Australia. There's one here.
Including Australia? Yes, there is one down at Puckapunyal.
The other side of the world for no particularly good reason. There's also one at the Tank Museum in Bovington, and I would note it's really tucked away in a corner there. But I would assume it should be able to run for Tank Fest and things. Anyway.
The only running one they've mentioned is the one in the Swedish Tank Museum.
Okay.
But it's quite possible the other ones are. It's not, but it's interesting.
But the twin engine does make it a lot harder to maintain for a historic vehicle. Yeah.
But I think that was quite. I guess they're trying to say that they're proud of their innovation of their own indigenous tank design, and for it to be seen by history, they need to get it out into the world. Otherwise, it's going to get forgotten about.
Propaganda was always important. So, noting that it never saw combat, it was appraised by many different countries and generally was actually very highly regarded as doing what it was specifically designed to do. But historically, the tank mission moved on, particularly with the ability to fire on the move.
Yes, yeah, that was a huge part of why they decided not to spend the extra money on upgrading to the D version. They did think about, again, a future version with a 130mm gun mounted in it, because, again, without
that would have been a tank destroyer and a half, wouldn't it?
That without the limitations of a turret, you can do that sort of stuff, because you're not confined to the space of a turret and saying, well,
big redesign of the autoloader though.
Yeah, but if you're going to be building a new version of it, you can build put a bigger gun in it. So, but at the time when it was designed in the 50s and 60s, the 105 was fine. But in the 90s, they're saying, well, if we want to build a new one of these, let's go for the bigger guns. But they said, no, can't be bothered.
Anyway, well done, Sweden. You made a truly awesome tank in the 1950s that was ahead of its time in many ways, and we salute you.
Well done. Now, what have we got, John?
I think it's time for...
beer review.
Yeah.
Now,
Rob, you have sourced a Scandinavian beer.
That's the Scandinavian beer.
Yeah.
How worried does this beer look?
Well, you've made a contactless delivery to my place because, of course, we are under lockdown. But buying alcohol in Australia is thankfully still essential. So
was it ever not?
So just saying, we have. It is definitely the warriest beer I believe we've ever done. This is called Jungle Juice, and it's got a man with a pineapple for a head.
Yeah, throwing pineapple grenades.
Throwing pineapple grenades while carrying a...
I think it's if you...
Is that some sort of squad support weapon, you reckon?
No, that's an M16.
Just an M16, okay.
Yeah, no, basically, if you took Rambo from the first Blood and crossed him with a pineapple...
And he's throwing 7 pineapple grenades at the same time.
And firing an M16 rather than M60. This is pretty much what you get. So it's called Jungle Juice Imperial IPA.
Yeah,
it's from
Norway.
It's from Norway. I'm sorry.
So we apologise to Sweden. Rob's done it again.
Love to hear your words in the comments. Anybody who's listening who wants to berate me for my poor choices.
Now we have got a standing offer out there to any of our enormous number of listeners around the world. We love you all. That if there's a beer in your country,
especially Alex Usall,
and
Ken Behrens,
and your country has got a tank we should talk about, then if you send us some beer, we will A, talk about your country's tank, and B, talk about the beer you send us. So just because there's a few people trying to line this up around the place, and I just wanted to make this open to all our listeners. Please do send us beer, and we'll talk about your tank and your beer. So anyway, let's get back to the Norwegian beer that is close to Sweden.
Craft Weird from Oslo. So it is a Cervasium.
It just means a beer. Now, I want to note it's a Imperial IPA, which an IPA is normally around 6% alcohol, and Imperial means significantly more alcohol than that. So how much?
What it means? Okay, it's 8.5. It's only a 330ml can, but it's an 8.5.
Jesus, and it's a cloudy IPA. I'd even say it's close to a New England in its haze.
Well, I'll believe you there because you're the expert on that. But it's got quite a sweet flavour. I don't know if it's got any pineapple in it, but it bloody well should.
Oh, it's just the hops will give you pineapple notes. There's a bit of coconut in there as well, which I'll try and remember what hop does coconut. But so malted barley, malted wheat, and flaked oats, which is why it has such a white fluffy head. That's what the oats do. And I can't read the rest of it because it's in Norwegian.
All in Norwegian.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so as with most New England IPAs, it is cloudy, not quite to the level of murk, which murkiness does come with that style. But the head is nice. It's got a beautiful nose, which not all beer does, but this one smells amazing. Like you could just sniff this thing all day long.
And even the flavour on the tongue is, as I said, quite sweet actually. So it's very nice. Now, I just want to share that the Jungle Juice name of it. In the Australian military, your Jungle Juice is the packets of cordials you used to get in your your ration packs. If you get all those together and you mix them all up, it's essentially what you used to call your Jungle Juice, because they were just various sugars just to make the water more palatable as you're out bush. So
I mean, that cordial also did disinfect water, though, didn't it?
Not
Really?
particularly. No.
Because I know that
It was just
Coddy's
not when I was
cordial
there.
at a strong concentration, which is the biggest cordial brand in Australia, will actually render water safe to drink. So I'd hope your jungle juice was performing the same role for you. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is a better sort of jungle juice.
Much better. Yes.
We're going to sound a bit silly in a few minutes because, boy, it's got a punch on it. But yeah.
Yep. We've been silly in a few minutes, John. We've been silly for the last hour.
30 odd
Anyway,
years.
so-
But yeah.
All right. So yeah, well, it's not a Swedish beer. I'm sorry, but my range of Swedish beers available in Canberra during lockdown is limited. And when I found out that there was a Norwegian one available to me nearby, I
You
said,
just figured it was the same thing.
well, that's not what I said. It's not what I said. But it had a guy with guns and jungle and said, well, that's all Warry.
Hey.
We're talking tanks, so it's Warry too.
Yeah, one thing I quickly want to talk about that we missed in the last bit is that for our listeners from the US in particular, the idea of deterrence for smaller nations is kind of alien because it's not something you guys have worried about in the last 100 years. But for a smaller country like, say, Sweden or Australia, it's not a case of having a big enough military to comprehensively defeat your larger neighbour, because you just can't do that. You'll bankrupt your country and end up like North Korea. The point is to have enough military capacity that attacking you will be so harmful to the bigger power that it's just not worth their time. And that's a lot of what smaller military is about, and it's a big part of why Sweden developed the S-tank in particular, not to defeat the Soviet Union, because that was never a realistic goal for a country the size of Sweden, but simply to make any attack on them so unpleasant and painful and unproductive that it was deterred. So it's that military deterrence that you're going for with these smaller forces.
Yes, my thoughts here on that is that if the Russians could land and roll through your country in 2 days, everybody would go, "Oh, that's a bit of a shame. Let's get back to a normal life." Whereas if you can force them to take 6 weeks to do it, in that 6 weeks, the rest of the world is applying political pressure on whatever invading force is happening, and so you've made it very expensive to the invading force in terms of manpower capability and the threat of somebody else coming along and kicking them in the back, as well as giving the rest of the world time to apply political pressure. So having a defensive force, even though the S-tank is not designed as a defensive fighter, they actually developed the doctrine for the S-tank to be an offensive tank. It's just in a different role than having the tanks roll into the enemy lines and start firing. No, it would deploy and would carry out counterattacks upon enemy positions and assaults, rather than just trying to roll through an enemy position. That would set up any sort of still fighting from ambush, but it's not just a defensive tank. It's not just a tank destroyer. It's an MBT, and they developed the doctrine to go with that idea of how they're going to use it.
Very much so. Anyway, my thoughts on the jungle juice, having drunk about half of it, is if I walked into a pub and it was on tap, I would definitely order one for a laugh.
But then you wouldn't get to see the picture if it's on tap.
Okay, if they had a can in the fridge, in that case, if they had a can in the fridge, it's one of those ones where when you've been in the pub for about 4 hours, you might
say, "Give me one of those." That looks tough.
Give me one of those, yeah. And you would regret that decision the next day.
Yeah, probably.
But at the time, you would have a lovely time.
Yeah, you'd have a good laugh. You'd have a bit of a laugh. That's how you got to approach these things. All right.
Indeed. Yes.
Now, we've talked about the S-Tank, John, but what else do we need to talk about this week? What has happened in the world this week?
So, welcome to this podcast coming to you from Australia, the 7th nuclear power of the world. Ha! Woo-hoo! We've done it! Woo!
We just had to screw over those damn Frenchies to get there.
Yeah, look, this is... we're going to have to be careful for some of the things we say because Australia has really vicious defamation laws, and the best way to explain a lot of this is highly defamatory.
And I'm paid by one of them. So.
Yeah. But so to what we're talking about is, and when this started happening, my first thought was this is some sort of meaningless publicity stunt that isn't going to be a thing. But then they wheeled out the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain for this joint media conference.
Saying thanks to my pal down under...
whoever he is.
What's his name?
What's his face? So Australia is going nuclear, apparently. And certainly we are acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. And some level of industry to support it. The backstory here is that in 2016 we tried to buy a French submarine that could not possibly meet our insane requirements for a submarine. And
somebody wrote a really good article about that.
Someone did. I wrote a really good article about it, published in print, saying this submarine was fantasy and would never actually exist, and we were being lied to. And
we should have just bought the Japanese one.
In that it was a real submarine that was a very good submarine, yeah. The problem is that defence has structured a magical set of requirements that cannot be completed by any real submarine. What we've announced, having shafted the French to such an extent that the French have recalled their ambassador for the first time in our history. And they've recalled the US ambassador, the French ambassador to the US, for the first time in American history. This is how grotesque what has been done to the French in all this is. And for Australia, again, our American and British listeners aren't going to understand we are not a nuclear country. And
we have some quite firm legislation about, and quite proud of the fact that we are not a nuclear powered country.
Yeah, we do have some research reactors, and the Manhattan Project did involve an enormous number of Australians. But
we did drop a few bombs here as well.
Yes, and there's always been a suspicion that we were what is called a threshold nuclear power, and that we might have the bits ready to be put together very quickly.
And we might have just kept one from the 50s while they were, while the Brits were testing theirs here. But we can't prove any of that. That's all.
That is all highly classified speculation. Yeah,
and conspiracy theory by us. But it's fun. It's fun to think about.
Yeah, but it is well known that significant numbers of Australian personnel go to American nuclear weapons school every year, and you've got to ask why we pay for that. But anyway, the point is, we are ditching the fantasy French design that couldn't be built, and instead we are now embarking on a design phase for a unspecified fantasy combined Anglo-American nuclear submarine design. So a country that couldn't successfully buy a conventional submarine 6 years ago now thinks it's going to have a nuclear program and build a nuclear industry as the simpler option.
Let's face it, what we're going to get is either the Tridents or the Virginia class sold to us at as scrap, rather than scrapping them by the US and the UK. And say, here you go, here's your interim nuclear subs, and thanks for the money.
Look, I've got a different theory on that, and this is pure speculation. And I should note that at this point, all the details of this program are in literally hand-waving. This will be considered over the next 18 months. So my guesses are as good as anyone's on this.
The words to use there are big hands, little maps.
Yeah, but the point is that the British Astute class production line is about to churn out the last parts of the Astute class. Which I might note is only a 7 submarine class, and we're talking about an 8 submarine class, so we're going to have a bigger nuclear submarine fleet than in the United Kingdom, apparently. I strongly suspect that what is actually going to happen, because the Astute is built modularly, they are going to assemble the modules in Barrow-on-Furness in the United Kingdom, and the Australian workforce is going to do nothing more than zip the parts together with a welder. Which is probably still more welding skill than we're actually good at, but because for very complicated reasons, mostly the fact that our Conservative government hates anyone who's a member of a union, we have eviscerated manufacturing in this country.
But we have to. It all has to happen in South Australia in order for them to maintain their seats there.
Yeah. So I think this is a very good educated bet, that because my first thought when this announcement was made was there's no spare capacity in the American yards. It's known that they're booked up out the wazoo. But what they're probably doing is with the yards opening up in the UK with the end of the Astute run. And yes, I know the Dreadnought-class nuclear submarines are in the pipeline, but apparently they are being built in a totally different facility. So they are going to ship... basically, Australians will make coffee while English engineers make nuclear submarines here, is what we're doing. And it's weird, and it just means that we're going to have submarines that we can't maintain or repair ourselves. And apparently there's going to be a magical reactor that never needs refueling.
And when we're speculating, how are we going to man 12 French subs with 100 people per sub? I don't know how many of these ones are going to need, but...
Well, a Collins has a crew of 40, an Astute has a crew of 100, a Virginia has a crew of 130, and we cannot get the manpower of trained diesel technicians to run our conventional subs right now. So the thought that we're somehow going to run 8 nuclear boats, and, let's remember that nuke school in the US Navy has the highest suicide rate in the US military, I believe. This is an enormous number of asks for a country that tried to just buy a diesel submarine and failed to do that for 6 years ago and hasn't gotten better at anything ever since.
After spending $3.5 billion.
To the most corrupt naval
defense. John, allegedly.
No, DCNS has been convicted all over the world. The Philippines, Pakistan, you look it up. We're not talking alleged, we're talking convicted in courts. DCNS / Naval Group, highly corrupt. I shudder to think, and I do not know, I can cast no aspersions, but it seems weird that they would give bribes everywhere else, but not here.
Anyway, so my first, it wasn't my first thought, but I was thinking, well, there are a number of areas within Australia that have already declared themselves nuclear-free zones, and I'm wondering how many more of those with ports in them, and Australian naval bases and ports are going to start declaring themselves nuclear-free zones in order to tell the government we don't want your nuclear subs within our nice little town here of, say, Nowra, Jarvis Bay.
Rob, we're going to do what we always do, which is take some land off some Indigenous people.
Good point. Yes, that's right.
Because, and I don't say that as a point of pride. It's just a horrible thing that we always do.
Yes.
And on one level, like our treatment of nuclear medical waste has been schizophrenic. We literally store it in hospitals, which is not the ideal place. For a geologically stable country, we probably should have a bit of land in the middle of the country that is never going to have an earthquake that we dig a hole and put things in. The country has never signed up to be nuclear. We've spent decades and decades convincing ourselves we don't want to be nuclear and that there are better alternatives. And for our appalling government, they're terrible people, to simply decide that because they've failed to buy a diesel submarine, they're going to flip the entire country into being a nuclear power.
Skirting around the legislation that they've already put in place.
Yeah.
That's been in place for the last 60 years.
Well, apparently Labor's supporting this decision, so the legislation's going to get changed. But
they're skirting around the outside and saying playing by the letter of the law rather than the actual spirit of not being a freaking nuclear power.
Yeah.
And non-nuclear proliferation.
Yeah. And I mean, part of the enormity of this, to try and get it across the international audience, the US has exactly once allowed the transfer of its reactor technology, and that was to the United Kingdom in the 1950s.
1958.
And that was grudging and entirely because the UK did have the scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project to duplicate that work. At that time, Australia was, and none of this stuff is out in the open, but I've spoken to people who I'm pretty sure had some idea of what they were talking about. Australia was basically asked to not go nuclear, and in exchange for that was given a whole bunch of other preferential treatment. And now we're just flipping away from that because what ifs. You know, we're making this pivot to a design that doesn't exist. We're just starting design studies now. So the reasons we're being told for this, none of it makes sense, which makes me highly suspicious.
I think the real reason, obviously, is that they want to start a nuclear industry in Australia in order to stop the renewable industries from going ahead, in order to make sure that digging things out of the ground and giving money to billionaires is the ultimate goal.
You know, there's a whole bunch of things that have happened this week in Australia. The former Attorney General announced in his disclosure of interests that an unnamed person had given him $1 million to fund his legal defences against alleged accusations that he had done terrible things.
And allegedly, I heard allegedly that it was from a drug syndicate or possibly foreign nationals. Or no, I've heard nothing.
No, it was from me. But it was from me. He owes me a huge favour. This is the problem when you've got an undisclosed donation of $1 million. Anyone could say...
John, I don't think we should get into the politics because we could say all sorts of wonderful things about the character in question.
Yeah, okay, my point that I was trying to get to, and I apologise for digressing, is...
That Australia needs an ICAC?
No, well, we definitely need some sort of anti-corruption body at the federal level. But my point is that all of these ideas that it's driven by Australian domestic policy is completely forgetting the enormity of the American and the British decisions in this. This is nothing about us. And I think this is more about
What about my friend from down under? Surely it was part of his decision. This guy that is on the video feed.
The guy we don't even remember his name. Yeah. So it is about Americans wanting more nuclear submarines in the Pacific on their side. It is about American basing, I am pretty sure, and a lot of smart people have said that.
They've announced that they're going to start increasing the American presence in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about keeping the British jobs in Barrow and Furness going, building so that their nuclear submarine building capacity we're paying for. The fact that Australians are notionally going to crew these boats that we'll have no capacity to repair or maintain suggests to me that basically we're becoming part of a American, British... I mean, they're literally calling this a new defence alliance, AUKUS.
But the thing is, because they're nuclear subs, it'll be really quick for them to transit from Sydney to Hawaii so they can actually get serviced. Because they'll be able to go there really fast.
Apparently they're going to have to go to Maine.
I'm sure they'll build something for us in Hawaii.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a significant amount of madness going on. In terms of the rest of the world... This is enormously increasing the chance of a war with China. And that's probably the worst thing because we just don't want superpower conflicts.
Because the way you stop a war from happening is...
not engaging in a naval build-up?
Yeah, no, it's building up an arms race is the best way to stop any potential conflict in the future. Been proven time and time again. Yeah.
And the scariest thing for Australia is that, I mean, Biden is unlikely to be president in even 3 years' time. And so what administration is there going to be? Because we're engaging in a 20-year active trust and I mean with the greatest of respect to our American listeners, and I know there are a lot of you.
We love you all.
We love you, but after the... frankly, Obama was not an enormous friend of Australia, and he had very good reasons for that. I respect that. But, and then Trump's unilateralism. We've had 12 years of not, having much of a seat at the table and to now be making ourselves completely dependent on whoever's passing through the White House right now is... I would much prefer
good business, I think, is what the Australian government would say. Good business.
Good business for some people. But if we were trying to be rational about what's best for our nation, a more Swedish route of independent deterrence.
Nice. Bringing it back around to the S-tank. That's a very good word to end on, John. Yes, if only we'd all just gone for the S submarine, maybe.
Well, literally, the submarines that are now going to have to stay in service into the 2050s that were built in the 1980s.
The Collins class was based upon a Swedish design, which was kind of and the new Swedish Goblin class. I've got to say, I like the idea of the Goblin class submarines are supposed to be the most stealthiest diesel subs around. So maybe we could have gone for those, but anyway, no, just can't. Wouldn't you love to have a Goblin class submarine, John?
Well, we're going for the AUKUS, so that's Australia, UK, US. We're all orcs now. The age of man is over.
But we're not allowed into New Zealand.
Yeah. Oh, I love the idea that the New Zealand Navy's going to find our submarines. It's like, you and what Navy? I think that's enough of us talking about navies. So
Out of Tech podcast, yes.
yeah.
Right.
On that note, I'd seriously like to thank everyone who's jumped on board this podcast, listening. We smashed through 12,000 downloads.
Yay!
This week, 10,000 was our big milestone. Last podcast we hadn't even crossed 10,000. Seriously, do let us know what you think in the comments on whatever platform you're listening to us on. There's some really interesting places people are listening to us, and it's really fantastic. People are coming on board. So
I'm hoping for our next podcast, John and I will be in the same room together. We can get up to even bigger hilarity and hijinks than we already are. Talking about tanks.
We finally
found politics.
We finally found a platform we don't sound completely terrible on. So I think remote podcasting's the way to go, Rob. But anyway.
No, it's good. It's good for me to be able to ride over to your place and have a few beers and go home.
Yeah. All right. On that note,
take care, all. Stay safe in the world, and we'll catch you next time.
Okay. Good night, everyone.